This 1923 factory portrait looks modern until you see the clipboard. The woman in the photograph could be a quality control engineer, a safety inspector, someone documenting progress in a gleaming new industrial age. But the numbers on that clipboard tell a different story, one that companies spent decades making sure no one would ever read. Elena Marsh finds the photograph in September 2019 during a routine archival intake at the Detroit Labor Heritage Center. Someone's grandmother has died, the estate is being cleared, and a box of industrial photographs arrives with a brief note. Thought you might want these. Factory stuff from the 1920s. Elena has processed 1,000 donations like this. Most never make it into the permanent collection. She expects assembly line documentation, maybe some posed shots of workers beside new machinery. Nothing that changes how she sees the city's celebrated automotive history. The photograph measures 8 by 10 inches, mounted on sturdy board stock that is yellowed but not crumbled. The image shows a young woman, perhaps 25, standing beside what Elena recognizes as a metal stamping press. The woman wears a crisp white lab coat over a dark dress, her hair pulled back in the Gibson girl style that was already fading by 1923. She holds a clipboard against her hip, angled slightly toward the camera. Her expression is confident, almost proud. Behind her, the factory floor stretches into soft focus, other machines visible in the background, overhead lights creating geometric shadows on the concrete floor. Elena almost sets it aside. Then she notices the clipboard. The photograph is sharp enough that under the magnifying lamp on her desk, text becomes visible. The woman has positioned the clipboard deliberately, showing its contents to whoever took this picture. At the top of the page, printed in neat capital letters, Efficiency Study, DEPT 7, March 1923. Below that, a handwritten list of names. Next to each name, a number. And next to each number, a single word that makes Elena's breath catch: terminated. But it is the column of numbers that stops her completely, because they are not employee numbers or production targets. They are ages, and beside several of them, in smaller script, brief notations. Epileptic. Slow learner. Foreign parentage. Club foot. This is not an efficiency study. This is something else entirely. Elena Marsh has worked in labor archives for 12 years. She has a master's degree in American history with a focus on industrial Detroit, and she has processed collections from 3 major automotive plants, 2 parts suppliers, and a dozen smaller machine shops. She knows what normal factory documentation looks like: production reports, safety incident logs, personnel files sanitized by decades of institutional filtering. She has seen harsh realities, worker exploitation, dangerous conditions glossed over in official records, but she has never seen anything quite like this. She photographs the image with her phone, then carefully removes the print from its mounting board. On the back, stamped in faded purple ink, Wolverine Industrial Photography, 428 Woodward Ave, Detroit. Below that, in pencil, Marion Dowd, Personnel Sciences Division, March 14, 1923. And at the bottom, almost too faint to read, do not circulate outside management. Elena sits back in her chair. Marion Dowd, Personnel Sciences Division. She types the name into the archive's internal database. Nothing. She tries the Detroit Public Library's historical directory system. Still nothing under that exact title, but when she searches just the name Marion Dowd, she finds a brief mention in a 1925 Wayne County census listing her occupation as factory consultant. That night, Elena cannot stop thinking about the photograph. The woman, Marion Dowd, looked so modern, so professional, so much like someone you might see today in any corporate office. But what she was doing was selecting human beings for removal based on criteria that had nothing to do with their actual work. Elena has studied enough history to know where this leads. She has read about eugenics laws, forced sterilizations, the way science was weaponized against vulnerable people in the early 20th century. But she has never held physical evidence of it in her hands, never seen it documented so plainly in a workplace setting. She decides to find out what personnel sciences actually meant. The Wolverine Industrial Photography Studio no longer exists, but the building on Woodward Avenue is still standing, now divided into street-level retail and upper-floor apartments. Elena spends a morning at the Burton Historical Collection, going through city directories from 1920 to 1930. Wolverine appears consistently from 1910 to 1929, advertising industrial documentation, efficiency consulting, workplace optimization photography. The studio seemed to specialize in photographing factories during a period when American industry was obsessed with scientific management, the system developed by Frederick Winslow Taylor that promised to make every worker movement, every production process maximally efficient. What Elena finds next makes her stomach turn. In a 1924 business journal called Modern Factory Management, there is a half-page advertisement. Personnel Sciences Division, it reads, "Let us help you build a stronger workforce, comprehensive employee evaluation, genetic fitness assessment, workplace optimization through modern biological science." At the bottom, in smaller type, consultation available for manufacturing, assembly and clerical environments. She contacts Dr. Raymond Chen, a historian at the University of Michigan who specializes in the American eugenics movement. They meet at a coffee shop near campus 2 days later. Elena brings her laptop and shows him the photograph, zoomed in on the clipboard. Raymond studies the image for a long time. Then he takes off his glasses and rubs his eyes. "Do you know which factory this is from?" Elena shakes her head. "Not yet. I'm trying to trace it through the photographer, but records are scattered." "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Raymond says quietly. "We have documentation that major corporations used eugenic criteria in hiring and firing during the 20s and 30s. We have the theoretical writings, the policy recommendations, the public speeches by eugenicists who worked as corporate consultants. But we have very few photographs, very few internal documents that show it actually happening on the factory floor. Most companies destroyed this material later, once eugenics became politically toxic after World War II. He zooms in further on the names. "Look at this. These are Eastern European surnames, Polish, Hungarian, maybe Ukrainian. Detroit had massive immigration during this period, people coming for automotive jobs. And look here, these notations. They're using phrenological language, disability slurs, national origin markers. They're not firing these people because they can't do the work. They're firing them because someone decided they were genetically inferior." Elena feels a chill. So this woman, Marion Dowd, she was walking through factories with a clipboard, evaluating workers, and then recommending terminations based on eugenics? "That's exactly what it looks like," Raymond says. "And she probably thought she was doing progressive scientific work. That's the horror of it. These weren't always cruel people. They were true believers in a pseudoscience that told them some human beings were worth less than others." Over the next 2 weeks, Elena digs deeper. She finds Marion Dowd's name in 3 more places, a 1922 article in a trade publication about modern personnel management, a speaker list for a 1924 conference on industrial biology, and a brief mention in the personnel records of a now-defunct auto parts manufacturer. The factory, Great Lakes Metal Works, operated from 1919 to 1957 on Detroit's east side. The building was demolished in the 1980s, but some records survived, donated to Wayne State University's labor archives. Elena drives to Wayne State on a cold October morning. The archivist, a patient man named Thomas, helps her locate 3 boxes of Great Lakes Metal Works material. Most of it is routine: production schedules, shipping manifests, a few group photographs of workers. But in the 3rd box, Elena finds a folder labeled Personnel Consulting, 1922-1925. Inside are contracts, invoices, and reports. Marion Dowd's name appears on multiple documents, billing Great Lakes for workforce evaluation services. And there, tucked between 2 invoices, is a typewritten report dated May 1923. The language is clinical, detached. "Following comprehensive evaluation of Department 7 personnel, we recommend removal of 14 workers who present unfavorable hereditary indicators. These individuals, while currently performing adequate work, represent long-term liabilities in terms of future disability claims. Training costs for deficient offspring should they be hired in subsequent generations, and overall workforce vitality." The report includes a chart, names, ages, countries of origin, and check marks in columns labeled physical defect, mental slowness, undesirable ancestry, and moral weakness. Elena photographs every page. Then she sits in the reading room, feeling sick. This was not hidden. This was not whispered about in back rooms. This was official, documented, billed by the hour. Marion Dowd was paid for this. Great Lakes Metalworks kept these reports in their files, right alongside payroll and safety records. She needs to understand how widespread this was. Elena reaches out to Dr. Sophia Lindstrom, a disability studies scholar at Michigan State who has written about eugenics and labor. They talk by phone, and Sophia explains what Elena is uncovering. Corporate eugenics programs were shockingly common in the 1920s, Sophia says. Henry Ford's sociological department monitored workers' home lives, their morality, their fitness to work. Other companies hired consultants who claimed they could identify inferior workers through physical measurements, family history, even facial features. The goal was always the same: purge anyone who didn't fit the eugenic ideal of a strong, native-born, able-bodied white worker. But these people were already doing the work, Elena says. The report I found even admits they were performing adequately. That's the eugenic logic, Sophia explains. It wasn't about current performance. It was about imagined future burdens. Disabled people might need accommodations. Immigrants might have children who spoke other languages. People with epilepsy might have seizures. Eugenicists convinced companies that it was more efficient to remove these workers preemptively before they became, in their words, problems. Elena asks the question that has been haunting her. What happened to the people who were fired? Most had no recourse, Sophia says. There were no disability rights laws, no anti-discrimination protections. If you were fired, you were just fired. And in a city like Detroit, where the auto industry dominated, being blacklisted from one factory often meant being unemployable everywhere. Some people left the city, some ended up in institutions, some just disappeared from the historical record entirely. Elena goes back to the photograph. Marion Dowd, standing beside that metal press, clipboard in hand, smiling slightly. Did she know what she was doing? Did she understand that every name on that list was a person with a family, a history, a life that would be upended because someone decided their body or their ancestry made them unworthy? The photograph had been taken deliberately. Marion Dowd had angled the clipboard toward the camera. Someone wanted this documented. Elena realizes this was probably a promotional image, something Wolverine Industrial Photography and the Personnel Sciences Division used to advertise their services to other factories. Look how modern we are. Look how scientifically we manage our workforce. Look how efficiently we eliminate waste, human waste included. By November, Elena has traced the photograph's provenance. The donor, the woman who sent it to the archive, was the great-granddaughter of a man named Tomasz Kowalski. He had worked at Great Lakes Metalworks from 1920 to 1923. He was fired in March of that year, age 42, notation on his file. Suspected tuberculosis, foreign background, numerous dependents. He spent the next 6 months looking for work, finally finding a position at a smaller shop across the river in Windsor. His family struggled. His daughter, the donor's grandmother, remembered the shame her father carried, the way he never spoke about why he had lost his job at the big factory. The photograph had been in his possession when he died in 1958. No one knew where he had gotten it, why he had kept it, but his great-granddaughter, going through old papers, had found it and thought a labor museum might want it. She had no idea what it really showed. Elena contacts her. The woman, Janet Kowalski Davis, lives in Ann Arbor now. They meet at a library. Elena brings printouts, carefully explaining what she has found. Janet listens, her face growing pale. They fired him because of eugenics? She finally says. Not because he did anything wrong? He was on the list, Elena confirms. I found the documentation. The Personnel Sciences Division evaluated him and recommended his termination. The factory complied. Janet is quiet for a long time. Then she says, my grandmother always said something wasn't right about how he lost that job. She said he came home one day and told her mother they didn't want him anymore, that they said he wasn't the kind of worker they needed. She thought it was because he was Polish, because he had an accent. But this is worse than we imagined. Elena shows her the photograph, the clipboard, the names. Janet studies Marion Dowd's face. She looks so normal, she says. She looks like someone you'd trust. I know, Elena says. What are you going to do with this? Elena has been thinking about that question for weeks. The Detroit Labor Heritage Center is a small institution dependent on donations, community support, and the goodwill of local businesses, some of whom have roots in those same industrial companies. She knows that publicizing this photograph, that building an exhibition around corporate eugenics, will make people uncomfortable. It will challenge the narrative that Detroit's industrial past was about innovation, opportunity, the American dream. It will force people to confront the fact that some of the city's most celebrated companies built their efficiency on the systematic exclusion and degradation of vulnerable workers. But she also knows she cannot bury this. The photograph exists. The documents exist. The names on that clipboard were real people, and their stories deserve to be told. She takes the evidence to her director, Marcus Webb. He is a careful man, former UAW organizer, someone who understands the politics of labor history. They meet in his office on a gray December morning. Elena spreads out the photograph, the reports, the contracts, the family history. She walks him through everything she has found. Marcus listens without interrupting. When she finishes, he leans back in his chair and exhales slowly. "This is significant," he says. "This is the kind of thing scholars have been trying to document for years." "I want to do an exhibition," Elena says. "I want to center the photograph, tell the story of what these consultants were doing, and name the companies that participated. I want to make it clear that this wasn't an aberration. This was policy." Marcus nods slowly. "You know this will cause problems." "I know. We have donors with family connections to these companies. We have board members who might push back. Some people will say we're being too political, that we should focus on celebrating labor achievements instead of exposing historical injustices." Elena has prepared for this. "This is labor history," she says. "This is what happened to workers. If we only tell the stories that make people comfortable, we're not doing our job. And Janet Kowalski Davis, Thomas Kowalski's great-granddaughter, she wants this told. This is her family's story." Marcus is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "Okay, but we need to do this right. We need more documentation, more context, more expert voices. We need to make sure we can defend every claim we make, and we need to prepare for pushback." Elena assembles a team. Raymond Chen, the historian, agrees to write contextual essays. Sophia Lindstrom provides analysis of how disability was weaponized in these programs. Elena contacts the Reuther Library at Wayne State, which holds extensive UAW records, looking for any union response to these practices. She finds references to grievances filed by fired workers in the 1920s, complaints about arbitrary terminations, accusations of discrimination. The unions were young then, still building power, unable to effectively challenge corporate personnel decisions. She also finds something else. In a collection of papers from a Polish community organization in Detroit, there is a letter dated 1924. A group of workers, all of them fired from various factories, had written to the organization seeking help. They described being called into offices, questioned about their families, their health histories, their countries of origin. They described being told they were not suitable for continued employment. They described consultants with clipboards, women in lab coats, men with measuring tools. They described feeling examined like animals, then discarded. The letter ends with a plea. "We are good workers. We came here to build a sanem life. They treat us like we are diseased, like we are criminals, but we have done nothing wrong. Who will speak for us?" No one did. The organization had no power to help them. The letter was filed away, forgotten for 95 years. Elena includes it in the exhibition materials. She gives the letter its own panel, the words enlarged, translated into English alongside the original Polish. She wants visitors to hear those voices directly, to understand that the people on Marion Dowd's list knew what was happening to them and protested it, even though no one with power listened. The exhibition is scheduled for March 2020, timed to the anniversary of the photograph. But in January, tensions rise. One board member, whose grandfather had been an executive at a parts supplier in the 1920s, argues that the exhibition is too focused on negative history. "We should be celebrating innovation," he says at a board meeting Elena attends. "We should be showing how these companies built Detroit, gave people jobs, created the middle class." Elena responds carefully. "This exhibition is about the people who were excluded from that opportunity. It's about the workers who were fired not because they couldn't do the job, but because someone decided they weren't genetically worthy. That's not a minor footnote. That's a fundamental part of the story. Another board member, a retired teacher, speaks up. I think we have a responsibility to tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. If we only show the sanitized version of history, we're lying by omission. The debate continues for 2 hours. Finally, Marcus intervenes. We're moving forward with the exhibition, he says, but we'll include multiple perspectives. We'll have a panel discussion, we'll invite scholars and community members, and we'll make space for people to process and respond. This isn't about attacking anyone, it's about understanding what happened. The board approves the exhibition, but 2 members resign in protest. Then COVID-19 hits. The museum closes. The exhibition is postponed. Elena, working from home through the spring and summer of 2020, watches as the country reckons with racism, with police violence, with systemic injustice. She watches as monuments are toppled, as institutions are challenged to examine their histories honestly. And she realizes that the story she is trying to tell, the story hidden in Marion Dowd's clipboard, is more relevant than ever. When the museum finally reopens in October 2020, the exhibition goes up. It is called Measured and Found Wanting: Eugenics in Detroit's Factories. The photograph is the centerpiece, blown up to 4 feet wide, mounted on a wall with spotlights illuminating Marion Dowd's face and that clipboard. Beside it, transcriptions of the lists, the names, the termination codes. On the opposite wall, the letter from the Polish workers. And throughout the space, documentation, contracts, reports, advertisements, census records, family histories. Janet Kowalski-Davis attends the opening. She brings her mother, Tomasz Kowalski's granddaughter, now in her 80s. They stand in front of the photograph for a long time. Finally, Janet's mother speaks. My father never told us exactly what happened. I think he was ashamed, but it wasn't his shame to carry. It was theirs. Elena has also tracked down descendants of 2 other workers on the list. One woman, whose great-uncle was fired for epilepsy, says, he had seizures, but he was a skilled machinist. They didn't fire him because he couldn't do the work. They fired him because they thought people like him shouldn't exist. The exhibition runs for 6 months. More than 3,000 people visit. Some are angry, some are defensive, some are grief-stricken. A few descendants of factory executives come, read the documentation, and leave without comment. But others, especially disability rights activists and immigrant community members, tell Elena that seeing this history acknowledged, seeing these names and stories preserved, matters profoundly. A local journalist writes a feature article. A documentary filmmaker begins developing a project. Raymond Chen uses the material for a book chapter on corporate eugenics. The photograph is reproduced in textbooks, in lectures, in museum exhibitions across the country. And Marion Dowd, the woman in the lab coat, becomes the face of something she probably never imagined her work would represent. Evidence of a system that valued efficiency over humanity, that disguised cruelty as science, that erased people with the stroke of a pen and called it progress. Elena often returns to the photograph when the museum is closed, standing alone in the dim gallery. She thinks about the 14 workers on that clipboard, the lives disrupted, the families shaken, the futures foreclosed. She thinks about how many other factories had their own Marion Dowds, their own personnel sciences divisions, their own lists of people deemed unfit. Because this was not an isolated incident. As Elena's research expanded, she found references to similar programs at automotive plants in Flint and Dearborn, at steel mills in Pennsylvania, at textile factories in New England. She found advertisements in business journals promoting eugenic workforce management to companies across the country. She found training manuals teaching managers how to spot defective workers through physical examination and family history interviews. She found insurance company recommendations suggesting that eugenic screening could reduce long-term liability costs. What looked like one photograph, one moment, one consultant's work was actually a window into a much larger system. American industry in the 1920s did not just tolerate eugenics, it embraced it, funded it, implemented it as standard business practice. And when eugenics fell out of favor after World War II, when the connection to Nazi ideology became impossible to ignore, companies quietly removed this language from their policies and pretended it had never existed. But photographs do not forget. Documents do not forget. The names on Marion Dowd's clipboard do not forget. Elena has started collecting other images like this one, building a database of photographs that show the machinery of eugenics at work, a hiring office with a sign reading, "Native-born Americans only," a factory medical examination room where skull measurements are being taken, a personnel file with boxes checked for racial background and family defects. Each image seems innocuous at first, just documentation of normal business operations. But each image, examined closely, reveals the violence underneath. She has also begun training other archivists and museum professionals to look for these details, to recognize the signs of eugenic practice in historical collections, how to spot the language of scientific racism in old reports, how to identify exclusionary practices hidden in innocent-sounding efficiency programs, how to read photographs not just for what they show on the surface, but for what they reveal about power, control, and who gets to be counted as fully human. The work continues. There are more photographs to find, more stories to excavate, more names to restore. The clipboard in Marion Dowd's hands listed 14 workers. Elena has identified 11 of them, traced their families, begun to document what happened after they were fired. Some left Detroit. Some changed their names to sound more American. Some ended up in asylums or poorhouses, labeled unemployable, abandoned by the system that had once promised them opportunity. One man, fired for a club foot at age 28, became a union organizer. He spent the rest of his life fighting for workplace protections, for disability rights, for the recognition that a person's worth is not determined by their body's conformity to some imagined ideal. His children gave Elena his papers, boxes of letters and organizing materials, and a photograph of him at a labor rally in 1935, his foot clearly visible, his face defiant. That photograph now hangs beside Marion Dowd's. The two images face each other across the gallery. The woman with the clipboard, representing the system that measured and sorted and discarded human beings. The man with the club foot, representing the resistance, the refusal to accept that judgment, the insistence that every worker deserves dignity. Visitors stand between them, looking back and forth, understanding what is being asked of them, to see the past clearly, to recognize that progress and atrocity often walked hand in hand, to acknowledge that the factories that built Detroit's prosperity also destroyed lives, systematically, scientifically, with the stroke of a pen on a clipboard, and to ask themselves, what systems exist today that we accept as normal, as efficient, as necessary, that future generations will look back on with horror? The photograph does not answer that question, but it insists that the question be asked. It insists that we look closely at images of power, at documentation of systems, at the smiling faces of people who believed they were doing good while they perpetrated harm. It insists that we remember the names, the ages, the notations in the margins that reduced complex human lives to categories of acceptable and unacceptable. Marion Dowd stands beside that machine, clipboard angled toward the camera, confident in her scientific authority. She could not have known that 96 years later, her photograph would become evidence against the very system she served. She could not have known that the names on her list would be preserved, honored, mourned. She could not have known that the efficiency she pursued would be remembered not as progress, but as erasure. But the photograph remembers. The clipboard remembers. And now, because Elena Marsh refused to file it away and forget, we remember too. 14 workers fired in March 1923, not because they failed, but because someone decided they were not fit to exist in the modern industrial world. Their names are written on a gallery wall now, larger than Marion Dowd's clipboard ever made them. Their stories are told, their descendants are heard, their humanity is affirmed. The photograph looks modern until you see the clipboard, and once you see the clipboard, you can never look away.